the U.S. Mint was erected on the site of an abandoned brewery in Philadelphia, then the nation's capital. Production commenced in 1793.
President Washington lived only a few blocks from the first mint, and it is thought that perhaps Martha Washington donated some of her silver to the Philadelphia mints for some of the first production. While we don't have any documentation on that, we do know that some of the first copper that was used was from Paul Revere's manufacturing company, and it was used in some of the first coins.
In the old days, there were no clay models. The engravers would actually work directly in the steel. This is what they generally looked like. And what they would do is they would transfer the drawing to this round image. They'd use an ink. And then they'd begin cutting and carving, cutting and carving, cutting and carving, shaping and forming, shaping. And this whole process, I mean, you can see, just look at the detail on this. It's just absolutely amazing. It could take up to 6 months.
In our early days, all the coins were made by hand. And they would take the metal and they would form it into strips using a rolling machine to get the desired thickness or gauge. Once they had the strip, each blank was hand punched from that strip to create a blank. And the blank was then taken to a screw press, placed on top of one die, another die would be positioned above it, and the screw press would be cranked down in order to stamp or impress the image into that metal. And in that method, it took them 3 years to make the first 1,000,000 coins for our nation.
The mint's slow pace irritated Congress, as it failed to meet production demands. More tumultuous times lay ahead, especially when a chance discovery in a remote riverbed triggered events destined to rewrite the mint's history. The first United States coin bearing the likeness of an African American was the Booker T. Washington Memorial Half Dollar. It was minted from 1946 to 1951. Money will return on Modern Marvels. We now return to money on Modern Marvels. In 1999, the United States Mint gave the quarter a new look. George Washington still adorns the face, but you can never be sure which of the United States might be emblazoned on the reverse. Every 10 weeks until 2008, the Mint will roll out a new quarter honoring a different state in the order that it joined the Union. 140 million Americans are caught up in collecting the coins, and the Mint continues hammering them out by the ton to keep pace with demand. In the early 19th century, the people's demand for federal coinage was no hobby. The economic health of their growing nation hinged on the Mint's ability to power a practical system of exchange. But the Mint's production still lagged. In the 1820s, the nation's first gold rush complicated its coinage predicament. After prospectors struck it rich in the mountains of Georgia and the Carolinas, they had a wealth of gold dust, but no efficient way to convert it to coins.
You could ship it all the way back to Philadelphia, where it was melted into coins and sent back, but this process took some 6 months. So you were forced oftentimes, as a miner or merchant or whatever, to use the gold dust.
A Georgia gunsmith named Templeton Reed had a better idea. He built his own mint, then bought the miner's gold dust and made his own coins.
Under the United States Constitution, only the federal government had the authority to make money. But he was the first of some 40 different individual and private coiners who made coins to fill the need for a medium of exchange in these gold rush areas when the government failed to do so.
In 1838, Congress finally took action, opening mint branches in North Carolina, Georgia, and Louisiana.
It made a lot of sense for the United States government to actually establish mints in those locations. That would be, I think, in some ways the equivalent of shortening the supply chain, is the terminology that we use today, as going to the source of your metal.
The precedent was set. In 1848, when the cry of gold echoed from California, a similar scenario played itself out. entrepreneurs in San Francisco opened private mints to convert the miners' treasure into coins. 5 years later, the government moved in, absorbed the facilities, and established a branch of the U.S. Mint still in operation today. In the late 1850s, subsequent gold and silver strikes spawned more branches. Nevada's Comstock lode triggered the creation of the Carson City Mint. And the Pikes Peak Gold Rush in Colorado gave rise to the Mint in Denver. In the meantime, the Mint in Philadelphia had moved to a bigger building, and its equipment now hissed with the power of steam. By 1860, it was pumping out 28 million coins every year. As the government-controlled coinage was gaining strength, the nation's paper currency, controlled by the private sector, was flaunting its weaknesses. Confusion reigned as 1,600 different banks were circulating 7,000 varieties of bills.
The further you got away from those issuing banks, they traded at a discount to face value because of the inconvenience of having to go take them back to that bank. And then once you got a certain distance away, they weren't worth anything. No one would accept them because they didn't know what the creditworthiness of that bank was.
You never really knew what the real value of a Tennessee note would be in Virginia. And in fact, you would never know if a Richmond note would be even acceptable in Baltimore. So those kinds of problems really meant that we needed to have a centralized point of issuing currency.
A catastrophic conflict finally compelled change.
In the 1860s, Congress had realized that they needed some way to finance the Civil War. And one of the things they did was to authorize the Secretary of the Treasury to print a paper currency, which was a demand non-interest bearing note. And in fact, it was called a demand note.
The Treasury began production in 1861. Workers operated machinery primitive by today's standards. But the basics of their technique were so sound that they're still being emulated. First, printers applied ink to a metal die. The ink filled the tiny recessed lines and dots of the engraved image, which was carved in reverse. Subsequent steps removed the excess ink from the die's surface.
I'm going to take a piece of what they call crinoline, or crinoline, and what you want to do here is just barely go over the surface, and it's going to take the heaviest part of the excess of that ink away.
After covering his hand in talcum powder, the printer then buffed away whatever traces of ink remained.
As you can see, I'm not actually taking the ink out of the engraving, it's just polishing the surface. So if you notice, all of the ink that's left is in the engraving. The rest of it's on my hand.
The inked die was then ready for the press that would print the banknote. The Treasury's earliest models were known as spider presses because of their long radial handles. They employed a method of printing called intaglio.
And intaglio basically means beneath the surface. It is where you press the image into the substrate, in this case the paper.
An intaglio press draws the blank paper, positioned atop the engraving, beneath its drum. This forces the paper into the die's finely recessed lines to absorb the ink. The resulting banknote features a subtle three-dimensional effect. The surface of the note is slightly raised.
If you pass your hand on any object that's intaglio printed, you will be able to feel differences and ridges, and that adds to the distinctiveness of currency.
That trademark feel of American currency is also a product of the specialized paper on which it's printed. And surprisingly, the main ingredient of that paper is something you might be wearing right now. According to the U.S. Mint, the life expectancy of a circulating coin is 30 years. The Federal Reserve estimates that the average lifespan of a $1 bill is just 22 months. Money will return on Modern Marvels.